Okay. All right. Thank you very much. So, yeah, so today I'm going to talk about correspondence audits. And first, I just wanted to show you this is the book he was talking about that came out a few years ago. And um, I would recommend, I don't know, I know that a lot of the universities in the US do have they have an agreement with Springer. And if you go to, I think it's springerlink.com, and you're either on a VPN for the university or you're logged into your account somehow, you can actually access the book for free. Because it's kind of expensive on Amazon, but it's not like I'm getting any of that money. So I would recommend you try to see if you can get it through your university. And like um, we're also happy to share chapters if there's something specifically that you're looking for. So today, I'm going to break this up into two parts. I'm trying to get through the first part a little more quickly so we have more time to talk in the second part. But essentially, in the first part, I'm going to give a little bit of a brief overview of what this type of method really is and why you would want to use it. Because I think not everyone's completely familiar with the reason why you would use these to begin with. So I'll talk about what they are, why you would use one, when you would use one, which is actually pretty important because a lot of people, especially grad students, often see these as sort of like a cool, shiny thing to do, but don't know exactly why or when they would do it. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we study discrimination because it's very closely tied to this method, though not exclusively. And then the need for using this method specifically for racial ethnic discrimination as sort of an example of what you might pick to study. So in short, what a correspondence audit is a type of experiment where a researcher is going to randomize one or more characteristics about some individual, some hypothetical individual, and to do to complete the entire process after thinking very carefully about what your question might be that you're going to answer with a correspondence audit, then you're going to send some emails or resumes or applications of some sort out into the field. So you're interacting with real people to try to capture their decision making process. And so you're going to test the effects of those randomized characteristics on some sort of outcome. So, for instance, in an employment audit, you might test whether or not the employers respond to people with an offer for an interview. And so you can read more about this, particularly in the book. In the first chapter, I give like a pretty long discussion of the history of this method. But people have used this to examine not just discrimination on the basis of race and ethnicity, but age, gender. And then you can see there's things here that we wouldn't necessarily think of discrimination per se. For instance, educational credentials. I don't think we would say that people are discriminating against people who, for instance, go to the University of Texas at Austin versus a different school, but it's a way that we can get a causal effect of different characteristics. So it's not just about discrimination, but it is differentiating between categories of a characteristic. And so people have tested these to find out to find discrimination and differences in outcomes in employment, housing, medicine, politics, all sorts of things. Even professors, there's studies where people have emailed professors asking about either graduate admissions or research assistantships, et cetera. So if you're familiar at all with these types of studies, you're probably familiar with the Bertrand and Mullinathon's seminal paper from 2004. This paper is really, really starting to show its age because they used newspaper ads and they faxed resumes to people. So obviously we've come quite a long way with technology since then. And I can only imagine how difficult it must have been back then to do an audit, a correspondence audit like that. But now, obviously, everything's online, and so it's much easier. But this paper has been very influential in this method. So one thing we need to ask ourselves is why would we do a correspondence audit? Because the answer shouldn't be just because it sounds cool and it sounds like it'd be something fun to do, because it's a lot of work and we need to make sure that we're doing it for the right reason. So I know this group is probably pretty well versed in this, but just thinking about really what we're getting at here is trying to determine causation. We want to run experiments because we're interested in a causal effect. And to determine causation, just sort of as a review here, we need to establish time order. So we need to know that the cause precedes the effect, which is sometimes quite difficult with observational research, especially cross-sectional observational research. Second, we need to find a correlation and know that the cause is related to the effect. And third, and this is sort of really the key one with these types of experiments, is we're trying to prove non-spuriousness. So essentially, we want to make sure there's no plausible alternative explanations other than the cause. So if you set up an experiment correctly, ideally, this is going to happen. It's not foolproof, as we'll see, because there's certainly ways that we can go astray with what we're trying to do. But this is ideally why we would do an experiment more generally, but for correspondence audits as well. So correspondence audits are great for particular types of questions. I'm sorry, experiments are great for particular types of questions. And I sort of have, in my mind, I think of it as this way, is that when we can manipulate a presumed cause, so in some way, whether that's changing the name on a resume to signal race or gender, or I think somebody had brought this up in the pre-conversation here about changing some sort of characteristic on a resume to show that you are part of a certain group. If we think that's the cause, that's in the causal chain, and we can manipulate it, then we can use an experiment. Now, if we can't manipulate something and manipulate a presumed cause, if we can't figure out a way to change that signal, obviously an experiment's not going to work. But that is not enough, because really we should think about, given how much resources these take and the ethical issues involved, I think we want to be sure that when we're doing these, we're doing them when we're trying to really get at a causal explanation, that the research is split maybe on what the cause could really be and whether or not the observational research or the other types of research that's out there is something that we can believe strongly. If there's a debate in the research, I think it's a great example of using an experiment to try to get at this, and a correspondence audit if you can do so. So I think this is a good beginning guide to think about when you could do it and when it's really valuable to do it. And is meeting both of these two criteria essentially. So I'm going to pivot a little bit and talk about discrimination, because that's sort of the bread and butter of correspondence audits. But I want to make sure that, again, if that there are things that we wouldn't necessarily think of as discrimination, but we're thinking about, differences between certain groups or certain characteristics, that those would still potentially be really good examples that we could use a correspondence audit. So first, we really need to define discrimination, so we're sort of operating on the same level here. And in 2004, the National Academies brought together a panel on methods for assessing discrimination, and they came up with this definition, which is differential treatment on the basis of race. In this example, they were focusing on race, that disadvantages a racial group. And we can sort of ignore the second part for now, but the first part is sort of the key, is that we have three parts that we essentially have to satisfy. We want to find differential treatment. It's got to be on the basis of race. So we're clearly creating a causal pathway here. And then there has to be some sort of disadvantage toward that racial group on the basis of race. So this is essentially, when we think about this definition and think about, like, they've laid out this as a causal pathway, they've showed us the treatment manipulation here, the race part. And we can see with our outcomes from our experiment what that disadvantage might be. And so I think it's pretty easy to see how, when you look closely at a definition, that this is a pretty strong opportunity, and this is why there's so many correspondence audits on discrimination. So just quickly, a little more background and like figuring out like why we need to do this to study discrimination. So in the US, the Civil Rights Act in 1964 outlawed discrimination on the basis of a number of characteristics. And so one way you could think about what this might have done is that it might not actually have changed it might not have changed people's desires to discriminate or people's intentions to discriminate. It might just have changed the way that they do it, that it wouldn't necessarily be outward and more obvious like it used to be, occurring in public, relatively common, with not much stigma attached to it. People were more open about their attitudes and beliefs. So perhaps you could just do, surveys and interviews with people about this. And probably more based in a conscious or active racial prejudice. This is what it looked like then. Obviously, we still have racial inequality and we still have racial prejudice in our society, but it's not quite the same as it was prior to the Civil Rights Act. So what's happened essentially is that we have a different kind of discrimination that we face. If the outcomes might not be different, the process might be different. Doug Massey has called this a moving target. And so his argument has been that as laws have developed to discourage discrimination in different domains, essentially people shift their actions so that it's more hidden or more easily deniable. And so obviously this changes all those prior characteristics across the board, that it's more covert, it's relatively uncommon, arguably. There's more of a stigma behind it, that individuals aren't as open about their attitudes and beliefs, and that you could argue that this could perhaps be more driven by an unconscious or latent racial prejudice. So there's lots of different ways that people have used to measure and examine discrimination. And I've sort of come up with this framework of thinking about this, and that there's sort of three really key parts to measuring and examining discrimination. Well, first is the perspective, second is the locus of action, and third is the type of data and method that we use to examine and measure discrimination. So the perspective itself is actually somewhat obvious once you think about it, isn't that it's really sort of capturing who we're talking to or who we're observing. And so the perspective could be the person who's on the receiving end, right? And this is actually quite common in a lot of subfields, is in surveys and interviews, not asking the people that might be the perpetrators, but the people who are actually on the receiving end of the action. So we might get a self-report of perceived discrimination. Some research, it's not as common now, but particularly in the 80s and 90s, a common method was simply to look for a statistical residual after accounting for important covariates in a regression. And so really you're presuming that a coefficient for Black or Asian or Hispanic is a representative of a discrimination effect, but you're not actually observing anything either from a person who's receiving it or is the person that's actually doing the action. Another is intended. And so in this case, it's a little fuzzy because essentially you might have a survey experiment or a lab experiment where you're asking people to do something, but there's not a real consequence to it. And so, first of all, people know they're still participating in research, even if you're sort of hiding what is happening. So I call this intended because essentially it's what a person's predicting they would do, but they know that there's not really, a true consequence behind their actions. And then finally, we could actually observe in the perspective of discrimination and see, usually from a fully covert experiment, what actually happens in the real world. For the locus of action, again, this is a little bit tied with the perspective too, in that we either see the individual level of those experiencing it, enacting it, or perhaps we have some way of seeing it at a higher group or organizational level. And then finally, there's numerous ways that people have looked at discrimination with various data and methods. Obviously, we're going to focus on experiments tonight, but we'll talk about why some of these other forms of data and method just don't really do what we want to do. So if we go back to that definition, differential treatment on the basis of race that disadvantages a racial group, we realize that this definition is saying that discrimination is an action. And again, based on those previous slides, we know that we can either ask people to assume, we as researchers can assume things about an outcome or action. We can ask people to recall past actions. We could predict hypothetical actions. And these are all really in the context of survey or interview data. There's numerous problems here, and probably the most important one that comes up is social desirability bias, which is that if we ask people to report things that have legal consequences or make them sound racist, there's essentially an incentive for them to lie to us. And so we basically just don't know from survey and interview research what the truth is in these cases. So what we really want to do is observe the actions of the people or the individuals or organizations that are enacting discrimination. And on top of that, we want to do it in an experimental framework so we can manipulate a presumed cause and prove non-spuriousness. So what does this look like? Well, in perhaps an ideal scenario, you could set up an experiment where skin tone is manipulated, and that's your signal or proxy for race. And so this comes from a study by Doliak and Stein a little over a decade ago now, where they were selling iPods. I almost forgot what these are called. It's so old now. Selling iPods, and you can see here what they've done is just manipulate the skin tone of the seller's hand in an attempt to see if there's discrimination in the marketplace for selling an iPod. But obviously, like, we're not going to always be able to use pictures. It's difficult to manipulate certain treatments and certain types of experiments. So this gives you a little bit better of an idea of what this might look like in reality for most correspondence audits, is that you're going to have some sort of email application, some sort of message correspondence where you have to change, in this case, race, although it could be gender, it could be numerous things. And we're doing it through names. So you can see here, these are two different messages with two different subjects, but you can rotate those through and make sure that what you've got essentially is the same kind of information, but you're keying in on the difference in the treatment conditions, which this case, Joan Olson is supposed to convey a white person, and Shanice Washington is supposed to convey a Black person. So from that experiment, you can see that in our outcomes end up being these response rates for different groups. I show you the overall mean and then the white, Black, and Hispanic groups here. And then we can convert these into essentially what's a relative risk ratio, but you can call it a discrimination ratio, because it's capturing essentially a metric that we could then compare across studies. It's a lot easier for us to look at this kind of discrimination ratio and say, okay, essentially, in this case, white people were receiving about 1.6 times as many responses as Black people. And then we could use that metric to compare across the study and say, discrimination was worse in our study than this other study. And they give you just one more bigger picture example. This is from a meta-analysis that we've been working on across different kinds of contexts. And so we can take everybody's data and take a look and see where discrimination is more prevalent in what types of contexts. Okay, so that's our basic setup for part one. For part two, what I want to talk about now is really the nuts and bolts of this, which is, why many of you are probably here, but I wanted to make sure we're all on the same page, and what this is and why we would do it. But I also, I do think it's important to think back, because a lot of these issues we're going to talk about here go back to those sort of the question of why you would do this and when it really is something that's worth doing, because these aren't easy. I think people think that because anybody can just go on and like type some emails to someone that, oh, hey, like this is super easy, but they're hard to get through IRB. They do take a lot of setup. Um, they're not like, those of us that are trained super heavily quant oriented, we're used to thinking about post hoc analysis stuff where, if we have observational data, we can do propensity score matching or some sort of fancy regression models where, any problem somebody had in the design of the survey, we might be able to overcome part of it in post hoc analysis stuff. That's not the case with experiments. The meat of the work is happening in the design phase. And so if you put something into the field and you have some sort of critical error, you're not going to fix that later. That's it. You're going to have to scrap it and start over. So we're going to talk about the basic design of correspondence audits. We're going to talk about ethical issues, which are super important. We're going to talk about the experimental unit, because this is another thing that often gets a little overlooked, but it's important in a number of dimensions. We'll talk about randomization and sampling, how you would actually on the actual ground create and send correspondence and collect the responses. And we'll talk about sending signals, and this should actually read treatment validity, because I'm making an effort to try to. I think this is a clear case of a clear type of validity that's not well understood, and so I corrected all the other slides and somehow missed this one. And what I'm going to do is, as we talk about this, we're going to just sort of scratch the surface on a lot of these issues, but I'm going to give you some real examples from either my own work or other work that I know of. And so there's plenty of things I can point you to. I don't expect you to listen to this talk and then understand everything and go out there and design the perfect correspondence audit, but it's a good starting point, and I'm happy to talk over email and provide other resources and help. I've helped, people, lots of people come to me, and I try as much as I can to help with this stuff. So in general, correspondence audits can cross probably any subfield in question you can imagine. Again, you can think of questions that you can answer with a correspondence audit. The real question, you'll have to come to, probably with the help of others, is this worth doing? You implement these with some sort of digital process, right? That we're doing. We're not having to, send people out there in the real world anymore, and we're not having to send faxes. We're sending emails. We're sending applications on an online portal of some sort. Oh, and I should say this: both types of questions and assistance from others. A lot of correspondence audits do a very basic job of, looking for a response period. And I think there's a lot of value from thinking about what an actual outcome you could get that would be more useful in the real world. So for instance, we have a correspondence audit that we just did where some people have sent emails to college admissions counselors asking basic information that could be obtained using Google. And so it may be that college admissions counselors do discriminate on the basis of race, but does that really mean anything if you could get that information on your own? So for instance, we had an audit where we didn't ask for information. We asked for a fee waiver for the application process, because many colleges will do this if you ask and you provide the correct information. And so we wanted to see, like, given that that should be a pretty standardized process, do we still find that they discriminate on the basis of race? And this is actually, I have two audits right now in the education sector where we've found significant discrimination against Asian Americans. And I think this is a super understudied area that people have just focused on the white black differences because they think that's where the most discrimination is. But what we're starting to find is that in education, it's not as much about white black differences as it is white Asian differences, which is really, really interesting and something I think we need to pay more attention to. So to continue on here, when you're designing a correspondence audit, and this gets back to the previous thing about asking for information that you could Google, you want to try to be realistic and minimally obtrusive. So realistic means, is this something that actual people are doing, right? You could send an email to anybody and ask anything, but you really want to do something that's actually mimicking a process that people are doing so that it has some meaning beyond just it's a causal estimate of something, but does that mean anything if no one's doing that? And minimally obtrusive because obviously, like, you are interfering in the real world. It takes people's time to respond to whatever you're asking them to do. And we'll come back to that when we talk about ethics. And then, these are challenging to implement for many reasons. But one thing that I find that people get a little too deep into is that they want to design an audit where they're testing a lot of different things, gender discrimination, racial discrimination, changing these other four characteristics. And that takes a lot more resources to do because the sample size needed starts to go up exponentially as you add more treatments. People don't quite understand that, like, this is not a linear process, it's an exponential process. And so that has implications for ethics. It has implications for many things. And so setting out to incorporate multiple treatments can sometimes just set you back too much. So again, this is just a reminder that, because I do think this is important, that, when we can and should use experiments and in particular correspondence audits here. So thinking about ethics, there's a lot of different things we could talk about with ethics. But I think that the main thing is when you haven't done this, when you've only thought about secondary data, that a lot of us are just using secondary data for analysis. Ethics is really an afterthought because we're not collecting the data. There's often no harm in using data that somebody is giving you. And so it's got to be the first consideration in experimental design because obviously we want to protect subjects, but B, we also want to get this through IRB if we think we can and we should, because if we really don't put an effort in on thinking about ethics, a lot of IRBs will just turn this down. And that's not something most of us are used to. So the things to think about here is correspondence audits are going to violate so many principles that we're taught that we're not supposed to violate. But the catch is that you have to make an argument that you can't do this we can't understand this topic without violating these principles. And so by their nature, they employ deception. And so that's something that immediately people start thinking, I don't know if we should do this. They have some level of intrusion and minor harm, and there's no way around that, right? We are interfering in the real world. And so even if the only thing we did was waste people's time, we have to think about how much time is that and how much does that time compound over the number of subjects that we need to interact with. The big one that often is the hangup for people in trying to convince IRB is that obviously we're not getting informed consent. There's no voluntary participation. And I have counseled many people about this, that IRBs come back and say, can't you just call the people and tell them in advance you're doing a survey and ask them to tell you what they would do? And again, that gets back to what we talked about at the beginning, which is why I spend time on that, is because that's an ethical issue that's tied in with the reason why we're doing this method, is that we can't get, we don't believe that we can get strong causal answers without doing it this way. That if we look at survey experiments on similar topics, I have a paper on this, um, there is evidence that we're getting pretty different answers if we're doing a survey experiment with the same exact idea as what we do with a field experiment. And another thing that comes up is that IRBs often want people to debrief the subjects after these types of experiments. And I can't tell you whether or not you should agree to that. I can tell you that there's a case to be made that that actually increases harm. Um, so, for instance, you can imagine a case where you do a field experiment like this. It makes big headlines, and then you debrief the subjects so they know they were part of this. You can imagine some company, maybe a small one, maybe a larger one, deciding that they're going to fire people in HR because it will make them look better as they're responding to something that has a backlash. I know this sounds a little crazy, but this is the point of the ethical IRB process, is that we want to make sure we think through all the possibilities that we possibly can and acknowledge them. And so, really with debriefing subjects, it comes down to what do we think would be gained by debriefing them? And if we do that, what are these possible harms like what I've mentioned? Uh, I'll talk a little briefly about this. It's sort of a weird side note. So this is the first sort of from my own experience part of this talk. Um, so you may or may not know, in the US, we have the common rule and the DHHS guidelines that define what a human subject is. And this is sort of the backbone of what IRB is working off of. And so in the US, it's explicitly we state that a living individual about whom, which is sort of the key phrase, about whom an investigator conducting research obtains data, essentially, right? And so I've actually, at the University of Michigan, the first time I put a correspondence audit through IRB, they came back and told me it wasn't human subjects research. And the reason why they said it was not human subjects research is because they said the decisions that we received about people, about applications, were an organizational level decision, and it was not an individual level decision. And so you're not actually obtaining data about an individual. The reason why I tell you this is because I've seen the entire spectrum of what IRB could possibly say about these types of experiments. And so, this was sort of mind blowing to me. I actually went back and forth with them because, A, I think it's problematic to treat these as not human subjects research. But B, I was kind of curious about what the thought process was there. And I've posed this with other IRBs at different universities, not in an attempt to get a study not classified this way, but actually just to see what they said. And I can tell you that there's huge variation in how people think about these things. Okay, so thinking about these sort of three key areas we talked about, deception. So there's multiple levels of deception here, because you can think about how essentially you're deceiving whoever you're talking to. If it's a job application, you're deceiving them into thinking this is a real applicant, right? And so that deception itself then informs our view of what the harm is, because on the one hand, it's possible that adding fake people into an applicant pool actually changes the HR's view of who they should hire. Because even if you reject, if they come back and they say, oh, we'd like to interview you, and you say, sorry, I've already got a job now, so move on to the next person. They could now see it as, if you put in really good people in the pool, they could see it as, well, these other people are not as good, so maybe we should wait, right? And so that deception is informing our ideas of the intrusion and the harm. Um, there's the possibility always of experiment discovery, which is when whoever you're interacting with finds out that they're part of an experiment. And so, at the lowest level of this, all that really does is it changes that one that N of one essentially and what the outcome would be. But in the worst possible scenario, they can actually sort of figure out what's happening and take this up with your university. They could take it up with the platform that you're working on and try to get your work shut down. And so you just have to be aware that, this deception could lead to someone discovering what's happening. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to avoid that experiment discovery in a minute. And so the thing here is this, just like with everything in the ethics process, is thinking through everything in advance, but also thinking about what are you going to do. So I usually try to have something in place in my IRB applications where I talk about if experiment discovery happens in this way, this is what I would do. With intrusion and harm, again, there's multiple forms of harm that are happening, and you want to try to minimize, but it's impossible to avoid some amount of harm. And one thing that it was difficult for me to see is, well, it was impossible for me to see until it happened, I think, was that subjects may actually question whether or not they're part of an experiment. And what I mean by that is they don't really know what's happening, but they know that it's not right. They know that this is not a normal process. And so it may freak them out a little bit. And this is the kind of thing that, like, if you're applying to jobs, this probably wouldn't happen. I think HR people will just say, this is strange, and just ignore you. But if you're emailing individuals, for instance, if someone was selling something on Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist or something, and you're emailing them asking about something and saying that you'll meet them, they could see that as a threat to their person. And this actually did happen with us in one study, which is why I'm bringing it up. And so you have to think about how, like, this is a weird form of harm that, like, you need to essentially at that point debrief them about what is happening. Otherwise, they could have fear for their safety or something else. I talked a little bit about the debriefing for the sake of time, we'll move on here. Something that's important that we often just don't think about, because it's usually pretty clear in the research that we do, and it's usually just individuals, is what the unit of analysis is. And so the reason why this is important in correspondence audits is because we need to think about whether we're going to have a within subject design, and that means that the treatment conditions can vary within the subject, or between subject design, where treatment conditions vary between subjects, or some version that has both. Generally, within subject design is more statistically efficient. There is a caveat to that that's quite in depth, and I will keep it very short and give you more information if you want to ask me later, and I can point you to a paper on it. But within subject design actually has a higher chance of experiment discovery, because if you think about it, the more touch points you have with one individual or one organization, the more information that you're giving them that they can then compare. And so, for instance, in the most absurd scenario, you could send 5 resumes where the only thing you vary is the name to signal race, and everything else about it, except maybe their address, right, is the same. So if you did this poorly and you sent these resumes back to back, you would have 5 resumes all coming in that look the same, with the same formatting, the same college education. It's going to lead to experiment discovery, right? And so a within design gives you a higher odds of this. That then, it is related to harm and intrusion. And so there's lots of things that happen within designs that can usually be alleviated by between designs. Also, not all questions and randomized characteristics allow within subject design. And I'll show you an example of this in a second. So usually you're going to have different things that you vary, whether or not you're really interested in those treatments. You sometimes have to. For instance, if you are sending out resumes in an employment audit, you may not be interested in changing the college that the person went to, or the major that they had, or their pretend internships. But you still have to do that. And so those may be, depending on what your design is to begin with, you may have to have some parts that are within and some parts that are between. So this gives you a real basic idea of what this might look like. In this case, all the manipulations are happening within, right? So we have two characteristics here that we're changing. We're changing gender, and we're changing whether someone is a native or an immigrant, and they're applying for jobs in this case. So in the first advertisement, we're just sending 4 applications in, and each of those 2 treatments, or each of those 2 conditions, are varied by the 2 characteristics. And so each one is getting, and we're picking up the within signal here. Here we have a mix of within between for the treatments. Well, sorry, so I should say you're always going to have a between of some sort, right? But in this case, we're actually having the between is that no employer in this case is going to see all of the treatment conditions. So we've decided that gender varies only between here, right? And so this would be a case where your signal for gender is happening only at the between level, but the other native or immigrant signal is happening both within and between. And then here's a more obvious design where no one sees more than one applicant. And so in this case, as you can see, what's happening is as we go more to treatment conditions only varying between, we need a larger sample size of the unit of analysis, right? So in this case, we're sending the same number of applicants to accomplish the same thing, right? We've got 4 applicants, but here we had to pull two job advertisements, and here we had to pull 4. And so there is a balance, right? There's no clear answer. This is why, again, this is complex, because the question then is not just, what's the harm of hitting 4 employers versus 2, or what's the harm of potential experiment discovery with 2 versus 4. Then we have questions of, can we get enough sample that we need if we're going to go this way? I put this slide up here for just a second because people get hung up on, what type, how do you get to the analysis part? And this is something that I don't talk about in this talk too much, but there are some differences if you did just a basic between versus a basic within. But in the end, I mean, if you've done your experiment correctly, even the most basic statistical tests, the correct ones, are going to give you essentially the same answer as a regression would. And at this point, given that quant reviewer expectations would be to see a fancy analysis, I always just give a regression no matter what. And then I end up, I will tell you, in my most latest paper that I submitted, we have a sort of absurd figure where we show 4 different model specifications at the very beginning, and they're exactly the same because the experiment is done correctly. And they should, I mean, there's slight variation, but it's a figure where you're seeing 95% confidence intervals, and they essentially look exactly the same. So we say, for those of you that are not as familiar with experiments, we're showing you that no matter how fancy we add in with, state fixed effects and all these other controls that we had, it's still going to give us the same answer. And here, just quickly, there are some cases, as Mike Volo and colleagues have shown, where between subject design actually performs more statistically efficient. But it's a very specific case, and I don't want to take the time to explain it because it's very statistically in the weeds. But it is highly correlated with higher response rates. So if you're doing something like an employment audit where the response rates are pretty low, they're usually like 10 to 15%, within subject design is still considered the best. But if you're doing something where, for instance, you're sending emails to somebody and like 90% of the time they respond, you may want to consider a between subjects design. Okay. So in experience, the truth is you usually like you can think through this and what you should do and try to get the best route, but usually you're going to end up with a combined with an in between. Um, and as I said, you want to consider how this part of design impacts risk of discovery and harm. This just gives you a quick look at what I did in one study and essentially how many different, as you add more treatment conditions, what all you have to deal with. This looks like a little absurd and it's not that many conditions. So just, it gives you an idea of like what you're in for when you start thinking about multiple treatment conditions. So randomization and sampling. Um, One thing to think about is like in some, our sampling frame can be easily identified, and that is a frame that is, essentially a population. So, for instance, you can get now email lists of things. For instance, we were able to pretty easily pull email lists of principals for our K to 12 audit for most states, and these are complete lists, right? And so it's a population essentially that we're pulling from to do our randomization. But in other things like job advertisements or housing advertisements, it can be a black box what that universe that we're pulling from or population that we're really pulling from is. Because how do we know that there's not some variable of certain types of employers that is correlated with who advertises on the site that we're using, right? In the case of the roommate study that I showed you a little bit about earlier, we had to think a lot about like what types of people are actually posting advertisements searching for roommates versus using other networks or posting on a different site or something like that. And so we have to think about whether or not this selection matters, which people often do not think about this very much because they're thinking about internal validity. And we want to think about, what are we generalizing to here? Um, so the random sample of experimental units is usually like pretty easy because you pull whatever you want in whatever fashion, whether you're scraping all the ads and then you're just random going through, a random number generator to decide what to apply to. But random sampling of contexts and settings and making sure that you have what you're actually generalizing to is a good question. And so, I think a key thing to think about is random sampling gives you strong external validity, which is, obviously a tenet of the experimental design, but it's not foolproof. And it doesn't mean, it doesn't mean that we've necessarily captured a random sample of the population that we were interested in. Um, just some quick examples from my experience here is that Uh, one thing that happens with employment websites is that a lot of major US companies don't actually run the searches on these sites themselves. They'll use a third party recruiter. And so it looks like you're going to apply on a website and then you're sent offsite to apply on another website. And that company is aggregating lots of stuff for multiple companies. And in this case, it's actually can trip you up with experiment discovery because what happens is they have systems in place to check for anomalies. And so if you've got, Tim Anderson and Jamal Anderson, and because of the way you've randomized, sometimes Tim has the same address that Jamal has, but you were thinking like it didn't matter because the company, across companies, they'll never see that this address varies like this. It could be a problem if you run into a third party doing this. So how do you figure this out? Well, that's a tough question to answer because I figured this out with trial and error. But I've also helped other people with these types of issues. And a lot of this stuff, is sort of just a frontier of like, you've got to get out there and do a pilot and see what works and what doesn't work. Um, So, just a quick couple of things before we wrap up here is the actual nuts and bolts of implementing this, because we talked a lot about design and now it's like, how are we actually going to do this? So it can require a lot of work. And I'm actually on a team right now where we're struggling with, we want to create way more resumes than we have in any other audit. And there's still not a good way to do this, to be honest with you, because not only do you have to create the names for the signals, you got to figure out a lot of different things to make this person look realistic. And in depending on the country context, that might include pictures, right? This is not normal in the US, but in a lot of Europe it is. um, you need things, arguably we need some sort of online footprint, and no one has really cracked this because there's not a great way to make up a bunch of LinkedIn profiles that we can vary things and quickly populate them with networks. um, I'll talk a little bit about tests for treatment validity at the end with names or other signals. And then there's a whole host of legal regulations that you can run into with this. The first of which no matter what audit you do, this is going to happen. You're violating terms of service. Well, even if you're just signing up for emails, you're violating terms of service. And so this last part, university involvement, is that sometimes this goes beyond IRB and the legal team at a university steps in and says, we don't feel comfortable with this. And I've heard many people get shut down for legal concerns rather than ethical concerns. Um, but the flip side of this is that there are a lot of tools out there that can help you with this stuff. So I've given you some examples where people have implemented Python, SQL, R. Leahy and Beasley have a standalone application. It will spit out resumes for you when you put in some criteria. Other things I've been successful with is hiring people on Guru, any of these online platforms where essentially, I know you're getting coders, um, but you can, I'm sorry, you're getting coders that you don't know, but you can test their work. And I've had a lot of success in getting essentially sort of one-off people to help me do things to speed it up. You can try to find research assistants, maybe in a different department, who have more expertise in this stuff in coding. And then, when you're sending actual correspondence, whether it's just sending emails or applying to jobs, you have to think about the realism of it, in terms of like what information would actually be provided, and the types of things they might ask in a real email. You want to avoid experiment discovery, like I said before, and you want to minimize non-replies, because the lower that response rate gets, the higher the sample size you really need, essentially. You can't always do this, but you want to make sure, if you can, that you're sending a quality message. If you're sending emails, for instance, you wouldn't want to just send like a short one sentence or partial sentence and think that this would be normal. You don't want to go overboard, but you want to make sure it's realistic and makes sense. I like to check while I'm doing my data collection and see where we stand. For one, it I have found some ethical concerns while this happened. For instance, with the roommate audit, we got an email back where the woman didn't know what was going on, but she got scared and she thought she was being threatened by someone or stalked. So we had to take that to IRB. You want to make sure you haven't made any mistakes. If you let the whole thing run and then you start checking things, maybe you find out that you made a mistake with randomization. Um, Save everything. You never know what's going to be useful for whatever reason. And so as long as IRB is okay with you saving everything up until a point, do it. Save all the emails. You can use Google Voice to automatically translate voicemails to text. So then you don't have any work there listening to anything. You've got the data you need. You can use POP3 and just download the emails. So if your Gmail accounts get shut down, you've got the data. And even it protects you, but also makes it so in the future you might be able to do text analysis. And this is a case where I did have a little bit of qualitative data in my dissertation, where it showed that people were drawn to certain types of college graduates over others. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to talk about, because I know we're short on time here, is this idea of treatment validity. Is essentially, is this signal that is what we think we're signaling to other people, are they reading it the way we want them to? And the obvious example here is using names to signal race. And so I've done a lot of work in this area because there wasn't a lot of work out there when I first started doing this. People were just using Bertrand and Mullinathon's names and saying these are good. And the truth is, it's not that simple. And so, just to give you a quick example, these three names, Darnell Washington, Jalen Thompson, and Ryan Jefferson, have all been used to say in real audits, have all been used to signal Black people applying to jobs. I think there's a huge difference between Darnell Washington and Ryan Jefferson, with Jalen Thompson somewhere in the middle. And the perception stuff pans out for this. To see this in action, I could show, and I will, this is what the perceptions look like, but just taking Bertrand and Mullinathon's study, if you look at these red diamonds, they're the mean response rates for each race. So on the right, that's the mean response rate for whites. And on the left, that's the mean response rates for Blacks. And essentially, when you're looking at their results, that's what you see. You see a gap, right? But what I see when I take the results by each name they used is that roughly half the names overlap completely. That if they had, for instance, not used Brad, which is way up there at 15.9%, their results would be lower for whites. Or if they hadn't used Aisha, their results for Blacks would go up a little bit. And you can see that their names like Jamal and Neil perform equally well. Jermaine outperforms Laurie. So names matter a lot, and we haven't paid enough attention to this. And I'm trying to push the boundaries on this, but not enough. And so this gives you an idea. This is from a paper in sociological science where I first started looking at this. It gives you from left to right, these are increasing response rates where people in the red, people believe that this name belongs to someone who's Black. And these are all names that people have used to signal Black applicants in different types of audits. And you can see the ones at the top not doing so well. Some of them less than half or less than 2/3 of respondents thought this person was Black, where these names at the bottom, they're close to 100%. So is this going to mess up our rates that we find in discrimination? Yes, because if some people don't see this person as the race we're intending, then obviously it creates a problem for the experiment. So I'm going to stop there. We can take some questions. I have a huge list of resources in the audit study book that you can look at, but I can also update this if you ask me, via email some questions about stuff, because obviously now this is, I don't know, 6 years old, but a lot of things have come out and there's a lot of great stuff out there.